tonight, November 17th, our class is on this history of the Strategic Defense Initiative from Lyndon LaRouche through Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump today. And our presenter is Susan Kokinda.
All right. Thank you, Tony. I'm sure everybody on this call has taken note of the increased stridency with which President Trump keeps talking about the fact that we are closer to World War III than we ever have been. He's been warning about it since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and obviously with the outbreak of hostilities in the Mideast, he's been warning about it even more so. And he's asserted the need to return him to office because, as he says, I will be your peacemaker. Now, Donald Trump often uses the term, as many have, peace through strength. You can certainly counterpose that to what we have today, which is war through weakness. But the world had an opportunity 40 years ago for what I would call the ultimate policy of peace and prosperity through technological and scientific strength. And that was the March 1983 announcement by Ronald Reagan that he had adopted a policy which he called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a policy of strategic defense based on new physical principles, based on directed energy weapons such as lasers and particle beams that would be used to shoot down ICBMs at all phases, boost phase, in the atmosphere, and so on. Lyndon LaRouche was, as Tony says, Lyndon LaRouche was the author and the primary public proponent of this policy in the years before it was adopted by Ronald Reagan. Donald Trump was actually a supporter of that policy back then, went on the record, I believe in the 1980s, in an interview in support of Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. He took steps in his presidency, when he was in his administration, to begin to revive that program. And in most of the recent speeches he's given, has been once again strongly advocating for building a missile defense system. Now, all three of those individuals, Lyndon LaRouche, Ronald Reagan, and Donald Trump, each in their own way, understood that this was not simply a defense program to defend ourselves from an enemy nation. I mean, it was true in the 1970s and the 1980s. It was necessary to defend ourselves from our adversary, the Soviet Union. That is not the case today. There is no single nation state which is intrinsically our enemy. Our enemy is a global elite which creates conditions in which wars are fostered and may indeed spread because of their satanic evil. That, frankly, is what we need a defense against. And embedded in LaRouche's concept of the Strategic Defense Initiative were the critical conceptions that we need to defend ourselves from that satanic elite. And before I go into some of the history of this, I want to read from a memorandum which Lyndon LaRouche wrote in 1984, March of 1984. This was after Reagan had adopted the Strategic Defense Initiative, and in which LaRouche was putting forward a fully worked out policy by which somehow, some way, we could still find our way to eliminating these weapons in tandem with the Soviet Union. I'll get more into some of the background on that in a minute, but I wanted to read this section from the memorandum because I think these 2 points are absolutely critical and are absolutely relevant to where we stand today. LaRouche said the political foundation for a durable peace must be, first, the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nation states, and second, cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefits of technological progress to the mutual benefit of each and all. I'll come back to this at the very end again, but I think these 2 principles, the defense of national sovereignty and the necessity of promoting the opportunity to participate in the benefits of technological progress, are absolutely fundamental to what we are fighting for today, and why it is the case that Donald Trump can indeed be our peacemaker. He understands those principles. And I think that is the context within which we have to look at his recent comments about missile defense. So what I'm going to do right now is play 2 short clips. The first one is an excerpt of a speech that President Trump gave in Florida about, I don't think it was last week, but maybe 2 weeks ago, in which he references Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. And then I'm going to play the last couple of minutes of Reagan's 1983 speech, for those of you who perhaps have never seen that, to get the sense of what it is that Trump is actually talking about. So first, here is Trump's speech.
To every American who is petrified that Joe Biden's catastrophic weakness will bring our country to ruin, which he has a great chance of doing, it's close to that anyway, close to economic ruin, I make you this promise as your president, and nobody else can say it. I will restore peace through strength, and yes, I am the only one that will prevent World War III, because we are very close to World War III. And I know all the players. I know them all. I know them all, every one of them. We will prevent. And this won't be a First World War, a Second World War. This will be obliteration, because the level of power, of weaponry, of power, you've never seen anything like. You don't want to see it. You don't want to see it. When they talk about global warming, because in 250 years our ocean's going to be 1/100 of an inch higher. And they never mentioned the power of nuclear weapons, where one madman can do damage the likes of which nobody has ever seen before. It's just crazy. It's just crazy to see it. It's crazy to talk about it. But I will stop, and it'll happen very quickly. There will not be a World War III, and we are closer than anybody understands. To protect our citizens from foreign threats, I will build a state-of-the-art missile defense shield. We will build that. We will build that. We need it. And it'll be jobs for America. It'll be built in America. You know, we developed the technology. Nobody else, by the way. A lot of people are like, oh, we developed the technology. No, technology was developed by us, and it works. I mean, you see it. You know, Ronald Reagan wanted to do it, but at that time, they really didn't have the technology. The concept was good, but they did. We have unbelievable technology. You can shoot a needle out of the air. It's incredible. But we do that. Wouldn't you feel a little safer, a little more comfortable if we could do that? And it's jobs in America. I will end Joe Biden's war on.
Now as I say, he's referenced this 3 or 4 times in recent speeches. This isn't the first time. If you look at his Agenda 47 policies, as far back as February, he revived the call for missile defense. So this is clearly something that he understands is extremely important. Now I'm going to take you back in time.
On March 23, 1983, 1 month after the Soviet leadership rejected the beam defense proposal proffered through the LaRouche Backchannel, Reagan delivered a historic speech. He announced that the United States would move ahead with what he named the Strategic Defense Initiative, an offer not for confrontation, but for collaboration.
I clearly recognize that defensive systems have limitations and raise certain problems and ambiguities. If paired with offensive systems, they can be viewed as fostering an aggressive policy, and no one wants that. But with these considerations firmly in mind, I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
Now, Ronald Reagan also in that speech made clear that he was prepared to work with the Soviet Union collaboratively, such that the threat of thermonuclear annihilation could be eliminated from the world. Unfortunately, that did not happen. What I want to do now is locate the importance of the Strategic Defense Initiative a little more deeply and Lyndon LaRouche's role in its development in the context of the fight against the global empire. Because whether you call it imperialism or the global financial class, which Trump recently called it, the ruling elite, the oligarchy, the British Empire, whatever you're calling it, the content of it is forces which would like to roll back the very existence of the nation state. Hence that first point that LaRouche made, especially Republican forms of nation state, and especially ours, which was the first, and I would say the most conscious Republican form of nation state. And these are the forces which hate the general advance of mankind through technological and scientific progress. Now, you can go back as far as the Peloponnesian War, where Athens and Sparta fought each other, or perhaps even further back, to see that one of the major tactics that this imperial oligarchy uses is to constantly pit nations against each other, to balance them off, to build up one, then build up another one, and so on. But to constantly play them off against each other in wars in order for the elite to maintain their control, as if they were puppet masters. Now, this approach has become extremely dangerous in the world of thermonuclear weapons, where thermonuclear weapons are at play, and where they can be delivered by ICBMs and perhaps now by hypersonic missiles. So one of the masters of this strategic outlook of balance of power and geopolitics was Henry Kissinger, who was one of the chief proponents of the strategic doctrine of mutual and assured destruction. This is the Dr. Strangelove policy of both sides having enough nuclear weapons to blow all of mankind off the face of the planet, who knows how many times over, with the assumption that, therefore, they will never go to war. That's a lunatic idea. Stanley Kubrick did a pretty good job of capturing how lunatic that was in Dr. Strangelove. And I want to identify 3 people who in the last half of the 20th century were very clear in their understanding of the lunacy of this and despised this doctrine. One of them was Ronald Reagan, one was Lyndon LaRouche, and one was Donald Trump. I think Trump appreciation of this was probably enhanced by his physicist Uncle John, who I think had a grasp of what the potential was for what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. So the interrelationship between these three figures and the development, the potential development or the support for the development of the SDI is what I'm going to talk about. Before I get into LaRouche's history, as I was reviewing some of our material on this, I was reminded by something which I had completely forgotten about, which is frankly pretty amazing. And that is in 2007, Donald Trump's national security advisor, one of many of his unfortunate national security advisors, John Bolton, publicly stated that he had been told by a very high-ranking Russian military official that he, Bolton, needed to know that it was Lyndon LaRouche who had been the author of the Strategic Defense Initiative. So I suspect that Donald Trump probably has a little bit of familiarity with the story that I'm about to tell you. I'm going to start with 1976. And I'm going to share the screen again. This was election eve, 1976. This, of course, was the Jimmy Carter versus Jerry Ford presidential campaign. And Lyndon LaRouche, who was running for president for the first time in 1976, went on national television for a half an hour and warned that if Jimmy Carter were elected president, we were in danger of thermonuclear war. He cited the utopian faction of people in the Trilateral Commission, people like Brzezinski and Schlesinger, people in the Council on Foreign Relations who would be populating the Carter presidency. With the kind of strategic policies which could trigger confrontation with the Soviet Union. Being very much aware of that danger, LaRouche was very much attuned to the implications of a piece that was published in Aviation Week in 1977 by Lieutenant General George Keegan. I believe he was retired at the time. I might be wrong about that. He had been head of Air Force intelligence. And this was a piece in which Keegan reported on the advances that the Soviets were making in the domain of these directed energy weapons. Again, lasers, which are what people are perhaps most familiar with, in terms of developing a defense against intercontinental ballistic missiles. One of the things people should just be conscious of, the significance of these directed energy weapons in part is not only their power, but their speed. These are speed of light weapons. So your ability to hit something going much slower than the speed of light is obviously vastly enhanced as opposed to kinetic missile defense, where you're trying to hit a missile with a missile, or you're throwing garbage cans up into space and hoping that, it's going to get in the way of the missile and so on. This is a very, using new physical principles, as LaRouche always stressed, was the critical aspect of General Keegan's report. We picked up on that immediately. And in fact, one of the first things that we did is we published a pamphlet entitled The Sputnik of the 70s, The Science Behind the Soviets' Beam Weapon. You can tell how long ago that was because we were charging $1 for the pamphlet. And the pamphlet actually went into a great deal of detail in terms of the science of this, and especially the economic implications of these new technologies. And this was always a hallmark of what LaRouche was talking about, that this was not just a necessary form of defense, but he always saw perhaps its most critical aspect as a science driver. increasing the productivity of the economy through the introduction of new technologies, as the Apollo project had done in the 1960s. Just when you start spinning out in your own mind some of the elements of this. I mean, first, the use of lasers themselves, and of course here we are 40 years later, and I think we're much more familiar with that. But improvements in targeting mechanisms, materials processing, computing capabilities. Again, if you think back to the Apollo project and the impact that had on our economy, this is how LaRouche saw this. And in fact, a little bit later, I'm going to play a short clip from LaRouche in which he discusses precisely this aspect of the Strategic Defense Initiative. In a speech he gave about a month after Reagan announced it, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, he said, which I was at, it was in April 1983 in Washington, D.C. Reagan had announced it. Again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. And there were like 400 people in the audience because we were the only people who knew what Reagan had been talking about. But in that speech, LaRouche said, we could spend $1 trillion, this was 83. He said, we could spend $1 trillion on this between now and the end of the century, and it wouldn't end up costing us anything because of the advances in productivity that this would spin out into the economy. So we began organizing with these pamphlets around these ideas. But in 1980, Mr. LaRouche had the opportunity to directly present this idea to Ronald Reagan. They were both on the campaign trail in New Hampshire. There had been some contact with the Reagan campaign prior to this, but LaRouche was able to discuss with Reagan on this occasion, at least, the potentiality of these directed energy beam weapons as a way of actually eliminating the MAD doctrine and defending the United States and potentially, obviously, mankind from the horror of thermonuclear extinction. And when Reagan was elected, even during the transition team period, LaRouche was called up to Washington. He was living in New York at the time, or called down to Washington to meet with members of the transition team. And then when Reagan became president, LaRouche was a fairly regular presence in Washington, meeting with members of the National Security Council, meeting with members of the intelligence community, developing both the scientific and the economic, not to mention the strategic implications of the need to actually adopt this policy. And again, we continued organizing around these ideas in many different kinds of ways. Again, I'm going to share the screen. We collected petition signatures in support of this, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Down in the lower right-hand corner is some younger versions of myself and my husband holding these petition signatures. We testified in Congress, and again, this is before Reagan announced it. We were talking about beam weapon defense. We were talking about the economic spin-offs of this. So we were both organizing the population in support of these policies, and LaRouche was working with the Reagan administration to actually adopt it. Now, LaRouche was playing one other critical role, which is that President Reagan had tasked LaRouche with carrying out a back-channel discussion with a representative of the Soviet Union posted at the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C. It was really necessary to carry out such a back-channel discussion. This is prior to Reagan's announcement of this. This was a dramatic change in the strategic doctrine of the United States. Reagan wanted to get a sense of how the Soviets were viewing this, and more importantly, would they be willing to cooperate with the United States in eliminating these annihilation weapons from the planet? And so LaRouche would meet with his contact in the National Security Council, would carry messages from him to his contact in the Soviet embassy, report back, and so on. And at a certain point, not too long before Reagan's actual announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the message came back from Moscow that the Soviets would not accept any offer to work with the United States to eliminate these revenge weapons. At that point, this was 1983, remember, this is right before Reagan makes the announcement, which we saw a few minutes ago. LaRouche said to his Soviet interlocutor, he said, well, if you reject this and instead you continue, you think that you can counter this with a massive military buildup of offensive weapons, you're going to destroy your economy in 5 years. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Add 5 years to 1983, you get 1988. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. But that last discussion happened shortly before Ronald Reagan announced the SDI. Now, on March 23rd, I was in Washington, D.C. Our organization had official White House correspondent credentials. And our White House correspondent, the morning of March 23rd, excitedly reported, because she had an advanced copy of the speech, it's in there. He's going to announce this. So we reported to Mr. LaRouche that it was in the speech. And LaRouche wisely said, hold your horses. Wait till he actually gives the speech. We later found out that James Baker III, one of the Bushies in the administration, who was Secretary of State, had substituted another version of the speech without Reagan's announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And the head of the National Security Council broke all protocol, went into Reagan, said, look, here's the original version, here's Baker's version, it's up to you which one you're going to give. So LaRouche was very, very right in saying, hold your horses. This was not a slam dunk until Ronald Reagan actually announced it. So we continued to organize support for this after the announcement of it. We put out, this was one of our most famous pamphlets, Kill Missiles, Not People. Support the President's Strategic Defense Initiative, again, $1. And here's an artist's rendering of how these beam weapons would work. You'd shoot them from the ground, they'd be reflected off a satellite and targeted to hit the ICBMs. This would be in the atmosphere, but could also be done during the boost phase as well. And we organized hundreds of thousands of people in support of these policies, both before and after President Reagan announced it. And frankly, I think it's one of the reasons that he actually did announce it. Now, I want to return again to the critical question of LaRouche's conception of what this could be if we developed it. And I want to play a clip from Mr. LaRouche. Oops, hold on, I lost my screen share here. Play another clip from LaRouche. This is from many years later, in which he describes, again, his actual conception of this. And again, I want to go back to I want you to think about those two principles that I put up at the beginning. The question of the defense of national sovereignty, but also the question of economic and technological progress. No.
I held a conference, a very largely attended conference in Washington, D.C. It was 400 or 500 celebrities of various nations, largely military and others, U.S. government, East Bloc governments, European, Western European governments. And I presented at that time what I presented as the alternative to Kissinger's policy. The policy, this is the policy which became known as Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, the important thing is to understand what the original SDI was, contrary to the idiocy which you hear in the press today about missile defense, which what you hear in the press is idiocy by people who are worse than idiots. They don't know anything about missile defense. So what we have to do is something completely different. We do have the ability to devise systems, new kinds of physical systems, which could deal effectively with thermonuclear missiles, that is, render them effectively technologically obsolete down the line. But that was not the extent of my proposal. The proposal was that instead of having the Soviet Union and the United States engaged in this crazy chicken game called SALT I and ABM, why don't we find a way out of the conflict itself? How? Because the Soviet economy, like the US economy, is collapsing. The present policies of the US economy, the present policies of the Soviet economy ensure a collapse of those economies, physical collapse. So why don't we change the policy? Why don't we go back to the space program of Kennedy? And let's do what we proved with Kennedy. Remember, according to the estimates which were made in the middle of the 1970s, the United States got more than a dime of additional GNP out of every penny the United States invested in the space program, the Kennedy space program. The point is that since increases in productivity come directly only from improvements in technology derived from fundamental scientific discoveries, the higher the rate you convert fundamental physical discoveries into practice, the greater the rate of increase of productivity per capita of population and per square kilometer of area. The problem of both the Soviet system and our own, though in different degrees, I said at the time, was that the United States was not generating a rate of net growth in physical productivity sufficient to maintain the economy. Therefore, we needed a program for forced draft, science-driven, technological progress with some mission, like the moon mission, but as a byproduct of that mission, such as the moon mission, we would generate spillovers in terms of technological progress by such a crash program to put the United States economy back on the plus side in terms of net growth. The Soviet economy does not work for similar reasons, different but similar reasons. Therefore, if the Soviet Union, with its vast military, scientific, technological capability, were to put that capability in cooperation with us in global technological progress, and if we focused upon developing countries, South America, Africa, Asia, to do what Roosevelt proposed be done for these countries had he not died, then the benefit of such a program would put the two things. Would put the two economies back on the plus side together with Europe. And it would also be a way of creating a global agenda which would solve the conflict problem. Now that was the SDI, the original form, which is what Reagan proposed on March 23rd, 1983 in his television broadcast. Nothing else. Later, to the Heritage Foundation and other clowns, that definition of SDI was sabotaged and destroyed. Now, we do the same thing later.
There's a little bit more to that where he then talks about expanding this beyond to a Moon-Mars project, which is very appropriate to today, given the fact that I think Tony's going to reference this in his remarks. The second launch of Starship was more or less successful. But again, the Soviets did not respond to this initiative. We did not build the Strategic Defense Initiative, nor did we certainly launch the kind of Apollo project economic mobilization which LaRouche spoke of. But Reagan's support for the SDI and his refusal to back down as late as 1986, when he met with Gorbachev at Reykjavik, he was not going to give up the Strategic Defense Initiative, even though it really wasn't being built, even though it was being sabotaged by organizations like the Heritage Foundation, which had rejected the idea of new physical principles, and they were putting forward these ideas of kinetic garbage cans in space and so on. Despite that, the fact that Reagan was still in the presidency and still committed to this was enough to provoke the Soviets to carry out an accelerated military buildup, which their civilian economy could not sustain, resulting in the disintegration of the Soviet Union, pretty much on the timetable that LaRouche had warned his Soviet counterpart in 1983. But so, 40 years ago, we had this opportunity. How did we lose it? Well, one of the main reasons we lost it is that as soon as Reagan announced this, the attacks against Lyndon LaRouche by the establishment media, by the intelligence community, by the Soviet Union as well, intensified to a fever pitch that we did not see again until what we've experienced with Donald Trump. Media attacks, legal attacks, slanders, physical attacks. Every effort was made to break LaRouche's, any kind of relationship that LaRouche had, either with the Reagan administration or with the scientific community. And of course, that ultimately culminated in a Waco-style raid. Well, it didn't get as far as Waco, but a raid on our headquarters in October 1986, precisely while the Reykjavik summit was going on, where Ronald Reagan was holding firm on the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was the beginning of a series of attacks on us. It included an indictment of Lyndon LaRouche by none other than Robert Mueller, and ultimately LaRouche's jailing in January of 1989, just as the first George Bush administration came into office. So we never, the promise of 1983 has not been realized, nor has the promise of 1962. We did have the Apollo project, but it was cut short and it was never continued. Just by reflection of where we were, next week is the 60th anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy. In each one of these cases, Kennedy, the near assassination of Ronald Reagan, the sabotage of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the jailing of Lyndon LaRouche, and now the unending attacks on Donald Trump are driven from the same place. And that is this satanic imperial oligarchy, which, as I said, hates nation states, hates the uplifting of mankind through scientific and technological progress. And that's what we are fighting against. That's what we need to defend ourselves against. There's not another country out there that we actually need to defend ourselves against. We could end up in a shooting war with somebody because of the machinations of the globalists. But what we really need to defend ourselves against is this satanic global elite and their commitment to crush nations and their commitment to eliminate modern civilization and technological progress. And the revival of Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, and I hope Lyndon LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative, by Donald Trump certainly presents an opening pathway in that direction of defending what is most essential from this global elite. There's much more that could be said about this, but I'm going to wrap it up there and turn it over to Tony to make a few other remarks, and then we'll open it up for discussion.